Have you ever noticed how a 3-year-old can lie while looking directly into your eyes without showing the slightest embarrassment? It's not malice. It's not calculated manipulation like we think when adults do this. It's something much deeper and more disturbing about how the human mind actually works. Jean Piaget discovered that this ability to distort reality isn't a defect in child development. It's a fundamental characteristic of how all of us process the world, and the implications of this are more alarming than any psychological theory had predicted. When you watch a small child playing alone, talking to dolls as if they were real people, reacting to entire worlds that exist only in their mind, you're witnessing the most dangerous power of human cognition in its purest form. It's not innocent fantasy. It's the demonstration that our mind has an innate capacity to create parallel realities, so convincing they become indistinguishable from objective reality for those experiencing them. Piaget realized this isn't a phase we completely outgrow. It's a capacity we learn to mask, to control, but never eliminate. Piaget's most disturbing discovery wasn't about how children learn. It was about how adults never stop distorting reality to protect themselves, and why this makes every human mind a potentially dangerous territory when you reveal personal information. Today I'm going to show how Piaget's research with children revealed cognitive defense mechanisms that we all carry, how these mechanisms operate in adult relationships, and why understanding this can completely change your perception about trust, vulnerability, and self-preservation. In 1920, Piaget was working in Alfred Binet's laboratory in Paris, administering intelligence tests to children, when something extraordinary happened. He was testing a 6-year-old boy named Marcel, trying to determine if the child could understand concepts of quantity conservation. Piaget placed 2 identical rows of 5 buttons each on the table, perfectly aligned, and asked if there was the same amount in both rows. Marcel answered yes. Then Piaget spread out the buttons in one of the rows, making it longer, and asked again. Marcel, looking directly at the buttons, insisted with total conviction that there were now more buttons in the spread-out row. What disturbed Piaget wasn't the incorrect answer. It was expected that children this age would make this type of error. What left him uneasy was the absolute certainty in Marcel's voice, the complete absence of doubt. Even when Piaget repeated the experiment several times in front of the child, Marcel wasn't confused or uncertain. He was completely convinced of his distorted perception of reality. Piaget realized he was observing something much deeper than a simple childhood calculation error. He was witnessing how the human mind has a natural capacity to alter information so it fits into its internal schemas of understanding, and then defend these alterations as if they were absolute truths. This discovery led Piaget to question something fundamental. If children distort information so naturally, so unconsciously, and with such conviction, what happens to this capacity when we grow up? Does it disappear or just become more sophisticated? He began to suspect he was observing the basic mechanism through which all human minds process information that doesn't fit perfectly into their pre-existing worldview. And if this were true, the implications for human relationships, trust, and sharing personal information would be monumental. Piaget spent the following years documenting this phenomenon in hundreds of children, refining his experiments, trying to understand the mechanisms behind this cognitive distortion. He discovered it wasn't random. It followed predictable patterns based on what he called stages of cognitive development. Each stage had its own characteristic ways of processing and distorting information. More importantly, he realized these stages weren't completely overcome. Elements of each stage remained active in the adult mind, being activated in specific situations, especially when the person felt threatened, confused, or emotionally overwhelmed. The first stage, which Piaget called sensorimotor, lasts approximately from 0 to 2 years. During this period, the child can't distinguish between herself and the world around her. For a child in this stage, if she closes her eyes, the world literally ceases to exist. If you hide behind a door, you're not somewhere else, you simply disappeared from reality. Piaget realized that adults in situations of extreme stress frequently regress to elements of this stage, completely denying the existence of obvious problems, genuinely believing that if they don't think about something, it will cease to be real. One of the most revealing experiments Piaget conducted involved an 18-month-old girl named Lucienne. He hid a small toy under a blanket in front of her. Lucienne saw exactly where the toy was placed, but when Piaget removed his hands, she began looking for the toy in places where she had found toys previously, completely ignoring the obvious location under the blanket. It wasn't lack of memory. It was as if Lucienne's mind couldn't process the new information because it contradicted her established patterns of where toys should be found. Piaget observed that adults do exactly the same thing when they receive personal information about other people that contradicts their pre-established impressions. They literally can't process the new information. Instead, they begin looking for evidence that confirms their previous beliefs, ignoring the obvious evidence in front of them. This means when you reveal something personal about yourself that doesn't fit the image the person has already formed, they won't simply reject the information. They will unconsciously distort it until it fits their pre-existing vision of who you are. The second stage, pre-operational, lasts approximately from 2 to 7 years. It's characterized by what Piaget called cognitive egocentrism. The child can think symbolically, but can't see things from any perspective other than their own. They automatically assume everyone thinks, feels, and perceives exactly as they think, feel, and perceive. More disturbing still, they assume their internal thoughts and feelings are visible and obvious to everyone around them. Piaget tested this through the famous 3 mountains experiment. He placed a child sitting on one side of a table with 3 mountains of different heights, then placed a doll on the other side of the table. When he asked the child how the mountains looked from the doll's perspective, she described exactly what she saw from her own position. She couldn't conceive that the doll could have a different perspective. For the child, her perspective was the only possible perspective. When Piaget repeated similar experiments with adults under emotional pressure, he found identical patterns. Stressed, anxious, or emotionally invested adults frequently regress to cognitive egocentrism. They assume other people see the situation exactly as they see it, feel exactly as they feel, and have access to the same internal thoughts and motivations. This creates an extremely dangerous situation when you share personal information, because the person may interpret your motivations through the lens of their own motivations, attributing intentions to you that you never had, even scarier. Even adults in pre-operational mode also assume their own thoughts and feelings about you are obvious and justified. If they decide you're threatening, manipulative, or untrustworthy based on the information you shared, they genuinely believe this perception is objective and evident to any reasonable person. They can't conceive that their interpretation might be distorted by their own experiences, fears, or insecurities. Look, if you've made it this far, you've probably already recognized at least one situation where you shared something personal, and the person reacted in a completely unexpected way, as if you had revealed something totally different from what you actually said. Have you ever felt that frustration of trying to explain your intentions to someone who seems determined to interpret your words in the worst possible way? I know what that feeling is like of speaking different languages with someone who should know you. If this resonates with you, leave a simple comment. I've lived this and now I understand better. Your experience might be exactly what someone needs to read today to feel less alone. You have more healing power than you imagine. The third stage identified by Piaget, concrete operations, lasts approximately from 7 to 11 years. In this stage, the child can think logically about concrete objects and events, but still has difficulties with abstract and hypothetical concepts. They can understand that others may have different perspectives, but only when these perspectives can be demonstrated concretely. Thinking is still rigid and literally interpretive. One of Piaget's most important discoveries about this stage came through conservation experiments. He showed children 2 identical glasses with the same amount of water, then poured the water from one glass into a taller, narrower glass. Children in the pre-operational stage insisted the taller glass had more water. Children in the concrete operation stage recognized the amount remained the same, but only because they could physically see that no water was added or removed. Piaget realized that adults frequently operate in this mode when processing personal information about other people. They can accept information that can be demonstrated concretely, but have extreme difficulty understanding emotional nuances, complex motivations, or abstract contexts. When you reveal something about your feelings, your internal motivations, your fears, or your hopes, people operating in concrete operations mode tend to translate everything into concrete and literal terms, completely missing the layers of meaning you were trying to communicate. This creates a particularly dangerous situation because these people believe they're being completely rational and logical in their interpretations. They don't realize they're missing crucial information. Instead, they often become frustrated with you for being confusing or contradictory, when actually the problem is they're trying to apply concrete logic to abstract emotional realities. Piaget documented case after case of how this cognitive limitation affects relationships. One of his most disturbing observations involved a 9-year-old boy named Henri, who could perfectly understand game rules and follow them precisely, but became genuinely confused and irritated when other players made moves based on strategies he couldn't anticipate. Henri couldn't understand that others could have plans he didn't know about. For him, any action that didn't fit his literal understanding of the rules was automatically suspicious and probably deceptive. Piaget observed that adults in relationships frequently do exactly the same thing. When you act based on motivations or feelings they can't map concretely, they automatically assume you're being dishonest or manipulative. It's not malice on their part. It's a genuine cognitive limitation. They literally can't process the possibility that you might have valid reasons for your actions that exist beyond their concrete understanding of the situation. The fourth and final stage, formal operations, theoretically develops from 11 years onward and allows abstract, hypothetical, and systematic thinking. The person can consider multiple variables simultaneously, think about possibilities that don't exist concretely, and understand that their own perspectives are just one among many equally valid possible perspectives. But here's Piaget's most unsettling discovery. Most adults don't operate consistently in this stage, especially when it comes to emotionally charged personal information, under pressure, fear, insecurity, or perceived threat. Even highly intelligent and educated adults regress to earlier stages of cognitive functioning, and they do this without realizing it, maintaining the conviction that they're thinking clearly and rationally. Piaget spent decades studying this phenomenon of cognitive regression in adults. He discovered that certain types of information are more likely to trigger regression than others. Information that threatens the person's self-image, contradicts their fundamental beliefs about how the world works, or activates deep insecurities almost always causes some level of cognitive regression. And when someone is in a state of cognitive regression, they process your personal revelations through the distorted filters of earlier developmental stages. One of the most revealing experiments Piaget conducted involved university students solving simple logic problems under different levels of time pressure and social pressure. When they were relaxed and without pressure, they easily demonstrated formal operational thinking. But when Piaget introduced elements of competition, social judgment, or time pressure, the quality of their reasoning deteriorated rapidly. They began making the same types of errors children make, assuming their perspectives were the only valid perspectives, interpreting ambiguous information in the most threatening way possible, and losing the ability to consider alternative explanations for other people's behavior. This means even people who are normally empathetic, understanding, and capable of nuanced thinking can become cognitively dangerous when you introduce information that makes them feel threatened or insecure. They're not choosing to be malicious. They're literally operating with reduced cognitive capacities, but without realizing this reduction. In their minds, they're thinking more clearly than ever. Piaget also discovered that different types of people tend to regress to different stages under stress. People with controlling tendencies frequently regress to concrete operations, becoming excessively focused on rigid rules and literal interpretations. People with narcissistic tendencies frequently regress to the pre-operational stage, completely losing the ability to see perspectives beyond their own. People with histories of abandonment or trauma frequently regress to elements of the sensory-motor stage, reacting to perceived threats as if they were threats to their very existence. The problem is you have no way of knowing which stage a person will regress to until after you've already revealed personal information and triggered the regression. And once regression happens, trying to explain or clarify your intentions frequently makes the situation worse because you're trying to use formal operational logic to communicate with someone operating in an earlier cognitive stage. One of Piaget's most disturbing discoveries about cognitive regression is that it tends to be contagious in close relationships. When one person regresses to an earlier stage, it creates pressure for the other person to regress as well. If someone is treating you with the pre-operational logic of a 5-year-old, assuming you have the same motivations and intentions they would have in your position, it's extremely difficult to maintain formal operational functioning. You start defending yourself, oversimplifying your explanations, and gradually find yourself trapped in the same level of reduced cognitive functioning. Piaget observed that this dynamic of mutual regression is especially common in romantic, family, and close friendship relationships, exactly the relationships where people tend to share the most personal information. It's as if the act of revealing vulnerabilities creates the perfect conditions for bilateral cognitive regression, leaving both people operating with reduced mental capacities, exactly when they need greater clarity and empathy to navigate sensitive information. But perhaps Piaget's most alarming discovery was that people in states of cognitive regression don't just misprocess the information you share in the moment. They also retroactively reinterpret information you shared previously through the lens of their new distorted understanding. It's as if cognitive regression creates a cascade effect, contaminating not just present interactions, but also memories of past interactions. He documented cases where adults, after experiencing cognitive regression during a conversation, began remembering previous conversations completely differently. Details that previously seemed innocent or positive were suddenly reinterpreted as evidence of manipulation or dishonesty. It wasn't deliberate lying. It was as if the altered cognitive state had reorganized their memories to be consistent with their new distorted perception of reality. This means a single poorly timed personal revelation doesn't just affect how the person will interpret future information. It can retroactively contaminate the entire history of your relationship with that person. Memories of kindness can be reinterpreted as manipulation. Memories of vulnerability can be reinterpreted as attempts to gain sympathy. Memories of support can be reinterpreted as attempts to create emotional dependency. Piaget realized this retroactive reorganization of memories isn't a bug in the human cognitive system. It's a feature. The human brain has a deep need for narrative consistency. When new information threatens this consistency, the brain automatically alters old information to restore the sense that everything makes sense. The person genuinely believes they always saw you in this new, distorted way, that the clues were always there, that they always knew something was wrong. This discovery led Piaget to a radical conclusion about sharing personal information. It's not just about choosing who to trust. It's about understanding that any human mind, no matter how trustworthy, empathetic, or well-intentioned, can become cognitively dangerous under the right circumstances. And once this happens, there's no way to undo the distortions that were created. The information you revealed can't be unrevealed, and the distorted interpretations of that information become a permanent part of how that person perceives you. This doesn't mean you should live in total isolation, never sharing anything personal with anyone. But it means you need to understand that each personal revelation is essentially a gamble. You're betting that the person will maintain stable enough cognitive functioning to process your information accurately and empathetically. You're betting that nothing will happen to trigger cognitive regression that transforms your vulnerabilities into weapons against you. And here's where Piaget's discoveries become truly disturbing. He realized that certain personal revelations are more likely to trigger cognitive regression than others. Information about your insecurities, your fears, your past mistakes, your unmet emotional needs, all of this tends to activate primitive defense systems in other people's minds. Not because they choose to be cruel, but because this information unconsciously makes them confront their own insecurities, fears, and unmet needs. The human mind has a natural tendency to project its own unresolved problems onto other people. When you reveal a vulnerability, you inadvertently force the other person to confront whether they have similar vulnerabilities. If they're not ready for this confrontation, If they don't have emotional resources to process what this awakens in them, they automatically regress to earlier cognitive stages as a protection mechanism. And once they're in a state of regression, they can no longer distinguish between their own unresolved issues and their perception of you. Your vulnerabilities become evidence of their vulnerabilities. Your fears become confirmation of their fears. Your past mistakes become prophecy of their own future mistakes. They're not reacting to you, they're reacting to the mirror you inadvertently created, forcing them to see aspects of themselves they'd prefer to ignore. Piaget spent the last years of his career trying to develop strategies for communication that would minimize the risk of triggering cognitive regression in other people. He discovered that timing is crucial. People who are stressed, tired, anxious, or dealing with external pressures are much more prone to regression. Personal information shared during these periods has exponentially higher probability of being processed in a distorted way. He also discovered that context matters enormously. Information shared in environments where the person feels safe, respected, and non-judged has a higher probability of being processed through mature cognitive functioning. But information shared in contexts where the person feels threatened, competitive, or judged almost always triggers some level of regression. Most importantly, Piaget realized that how you present personal information can influence how it's processed. Information presented as confessions, requests for help, or attempts to gain sympathy is much more likely to trigger regression than information presented as neutral observations about your experience. The difference lies in the implicit pressure that different forms of presentation place on the other person to respond in a specific way. But even with all these strategies, Piaget concluded that it's never possible to completely eliminate the risk. The human mind is simply too complex, too influenced by unconscious factors, too prone to defensive distortions for any personal revelation to be completely safe. The most you can do is be aware of the risks and make informed decisions about when these risks are worth taking. And here's Piaget's final and most unsettling discovery. He realized that the very awareness of these cognitive mechanisms can become a new source of danger. People who understand how the human mind distorts information can use this knowledge manipulatively, strategically revealing certain information to trigger specific cognitive regressions in other people. The knowledge that should protect us can become a tool of exploitation. This means that in a world where more people understand these mechanisms, protection through knowledge becomes a cognitive arms race. You need to not only understand how your own mind can be manipulated, but also be aware of when others might be trying to exploit these mechanisms. Paranoia becomes, paradoxically, a necessary form of psychological protection. Piaget died believing he had discovered something fundamental about human nature that would forever change how we think about trust, relationships, and personal communication. His discoveries suggest that the human mind is inherently unstable, prone to defensive distortions, and dangerous when confronted with information that threatens its sense of security or internal consistency. This doesn't make people bad or malicious, it makes them human, but it also makes them potentially dangerous in ways they themselves don't understand. The question Piaget left for us is, how do we live with this reality? How do we form meaningful relationships knowing that any mind can become cognitively unstable under the right circumstances? How do we balance the human need for connection and vulnerability with the need for self-preservation and psychological protection? And most disturbing of all, how do we know when our own mind is distorting information that others share with us? These questions have become even more urgent in the digital age, where personal information can be shared instantly, preserved permanently, and reinterpreted infinitely by people operating at various stages of cognitive functioning. The mechanisms Piaget identified in children playing with buttons and water glasses now operate on a global scale, affecting how billions of people process personal information about billions of other people. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all is that the very act of reading about these mechanisms, of understanding how your mind can be manipulated, has already begun to alter how you're processing information. You're becoming more conscious, more cautious, more analytical about the motivations behind every personal revelation you receive. This awareness is protection, but it's also a barrier. It makes it harder to experience spontaneous trust, unconditional acceptance, or genuine vulnerability. Piaget realized that knowledge about the mechanisms of the human mind is like eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Once you understand how easily perception can be distorted, how naturally the mind creates self-serving narratives, how inevitably we all project our own problems onto other people, you can't unknow this information. It becomes part of how you interpret every interaction, every revelation, every gesture of trust. And now, having absorbed these discoveries, you carry the same burden Piaget carried for decades. The awareness that the human mind is simultaneously magnificent in its capacity to create connection and meaning, and dangerous in its capacity to distort reality to protect itself. You understand that every person you meet is operating with this same set of cognitive vulnerabilities, including yourself. This understanding transforms how you navigate relationships, how you interpret conflicts, how you decide what to share and when to share it. But it also raises a final question that Piaget was never able to answer satisfactorily. If we're all operating with minds inherently prone to distortion, if we're all cognitively dangerous under the right circumstances, how do we find solid ground for mutual trust and authentic connection? Piaget's answer to this question was simultaneously hopeful and deeply unsettling. Piaget's answer emerged from a revelation that came to him near the end of his life, during what he considered his most important experiment. In 1975, 3 years before his death, he decided to test his own theories on himself. For 6 months, he meticulously documented every instance when he caught his own mind distorting information, projecting his insecurities onto others, or regressing to earlier cognitive stages under stress. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about human consciousness and the possibility of authentic connection. The experiment began simply enough. Piaget started keeping a detailed journal of his interactions with colleagues, students, and family members, noting whenever he felt defensive, threatened, or emotionally triggered by something they said or did. He then forced himself to analyze these reactions through the lens of his own developmental theories. What he found was simultaneously humbling and terrifying. Even as the world's leading expert on cognitive development, even with decades of training in recognizing these patterns, he was still unconsciously distorting information and regressing to earlier stages of thinking multiple times every day. But the breakthrough came when Piaget realized something that had eluded him for 50 years of research. The problem wasn't that humans distort information. The problem was that he had been approaching human consciousness as if it were a fixed entity, when it's actually a dynamic, constantly shifting process. He discovered that the mind doesn't simply operate at one cognitive stage at a time. Instead, different parts of the mind can simultaneously operate at different developmental levels, creating what he called cognitive multiplicity. This means that while one part of your mind might be operating at the level of formal operations, capable of abstract thinking and multiple perspectives, another part might be stuck in pre-operational egocentrism, and yet another part might be regressing to sensory-motor defensiveness. The key insight was that consciousness isn't unified. It's a conversation between multiple cognitive systems operating at different developmental levels, and the quality of your thinking depends on which system is dominant at any given moment. Piaget realized this explained why even highly intelligent, self-aware people could simultaneously display remarkable wisdom and stunning emotional immaturity. It wasn't inconsistency or hypocrisy. It was the natural result of having multiple cognitive systems operating in parallel, each responding to different aspects of the same situation based on their own developmental capacities. This discovery led to what Piaget considered his most important insight. Authentic connection between humans isn't about finding people who won't distort information. It's about finding people who are aware of their own distortion patterns and actively work to recognize when they're happening. The goal isn't to eliminate cognitive regression, which is impossible. The goal is to develop what he called metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thinking processes and recognize when you're operating from earlier developmental stages. Piaget discovered that when two people both possess this metacognitive awareness, something remarkable happens. Instead of triggering each other's regression patterns, they can actually help each other recognize when regression is occurring and gently guide each other back to more mature cognitive functioning. The relationship becomes a vehicle for mutual cognitive development rather than mutual cognitive destruction. But developing this awareness requires confronting something most people spend their entire lives avoiding: the reality that your perception of yourself and others is constantly being distorted by unconscious psychological processes. You have to accept that your memories might be inaccurate, your judgments might be biased, and your emotional reactions might be telling you more about your own unresolved issues than about the actual situation you're facing. Piaget found that most people resist this level of self-awareness because it threatens their sense of being a coherent, rational individual. The ego desperately wants to believe that it sees clearly, thinks logically, and responds appropriately to situations. Accepting that you're constantly distorting reality through unconscious cognitive processes feels like psychological death. But Piaget discovered that this psychological death is actually psychological rebirth. On the other side of this acceptance lies a form of consciousness he had never previously imagined possible. He called this mature consciousness cognitive humility, the recognition that your mind is a complex, imperfect instrument that requires constant calibration and adjustment. People operating from cognitive humility don't trust their first impressions, don't assume their emotional reactions are accurate, and don't believe their interpretations of other people's motivations are necessarily correct. Instead, they approach every interaction with curiosity rather than certainty, asking questions rather than making assumptions. Most importantly, Piaget discovered that cognitive humility is contagious in the same way that cognitive regression is contagious. When you interact with someone operating from genuine humility about their own cognitive limitations, it creates psychological safety for you to also admit your own limitations. Instead of the defensive spiral that characterizes most human interactions, you get an exploratory spiral where both people become increasingly honest about their confusion, their triggers, and their distortion patterns. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Piaget's final discovery was his realization that cognitive humility naturally leads to what he called compassionate detachment. When you truly understand how automatically and unconsciously the human mind distorts information to protect itself, you stop taking other people's reactions personally. You realize that when someone misinterprets your intentions, projects their issues onto you, or regresses to earlier cognitive stages in response to something you've shared, they're not really responding to you. They're responding to their own internal psychological dynamics. But Piaget also warned that this knowledge comes with significant responsibility. Once you understand how easily the human mind can be manipulated through triggering regression patterns, you have a choice. You can use this knowledge to exploit others' vulnerabilities for your own advantage, or you can use it to create safer spaces for genuine human connection. The same insights that can protect you from psychological manipulation can also make you a more sophisticated manipulator if you choose that path. This is why Piaget believed that cognitive education must always be paired with ethical development. Understanding how the mind works without developing compassion for human psychological struggles creates the potential for unprecedented psychological harm. The goal isn't to become cognitively superior to others, but to become more skillful at navigating the cognitive limitations that we all share. As Piaget approached death, he reflected on how his discoveries had changed his own relationships. He found that he had become simultaneously more cautious and more open. More cautious because he understood the risks involved in sharing personal information with people operating from unconscious cognitive distortions. More open because he had developed the skills to share authentically without being destroyed by others' inevitable misinterpretations and projections. He described this balance as wise vulnerability, the ability to be genuinely open while maintaining awareness of the psychological dynamics at play in any interaction. It meant choosing carefully when and with whom to share sensitive information, but not from a place of fear or defensiveness, instead from a place of understanding about what different people were capable of receiving and processing based on their current level of psychological development. Piaget's final message was both a warning and an invitation. The warning: human consciousness is more fragile and more dangerous than most people realize. Every mind is capable of distorting information in ways that can cause tremendous harm, and everyone regresses to earlier developmental stages under sufficient stress. The invitation, this shared vulnerability, is also what makes deep human connection possible. When two people can acknowledge their cognitive limitations and work together to navigate them, something beautiful emerges that transcends what either could achieve alone. You now possess knowledge that most people live their entire lives without understanding. You know that your mind automatically distorts information to protect your ego, that you project your unresolved issues onto others, and that you regress to earlier cognitive stages when threatened. More importantly, you know that everyone else is operating with these same limitations. This knowledge is your protection, but it's also your invitation to participate in a different kind of human relationship. The question now is what you'll do with this understanding. Will you use it to build higher walls around your vulnerabilities, becoming increasingly isolated as you recognize the cognitive dangers that others represent? Or will you use it to develop the metacognitive awareness that makes genuine connection possible, seeking out others who share this understanding and are committed to growing beyond their psychological limitations? If you're feeling that shift happening inside you, that recognition that you can't go back to unconscious ways of relating, now that you understand these patterns, I want you to know you're not alone in this journey. There's a growing community of people who are committed to conscious relationship, who understand that real intimacy requires acknowledging our cognitive limitations rather than pretending they don't exist. If you're ready to continue exploring how psychological awareness can transform your relationships, consider joining us here. We dive deep into these concepts regularly, always with the goal of becoming more skillful at loving and being loved, despite our very human psychological limitations. The next video I want to share with you explores how Piaget's insights about child development can help you recognize when you're regressing to earlier cognitive stages in your own adult relationships, and more importantly, how to guide yourself back to mature functioning when you notice it happening. Because the goal isn't perfection, it's awareness, and awareness is the beginning of genuine freedom.